Welcome everybody tonight. Thanks for your patience here at the beginning. Like I said, we had a lot of people joining the meeting at the end there, but Iric's presentation is up. We're ready to go. I want to introduce Iric Nathanson. Iric is a longtime local history writer. He's written a number of books on different facets of Minneapolis history, also St. Paul, I believe. Isn't that correct, Iric?
Yes.
And his latest one is a very timely book on Minneapolis's Lake Street, one of, if not the major principal commercial thoroughfare through Minneapolis, which has seen considerable turmoil this year in our very bizarre and disturbing 2020. Iric is going to talk about give us a look back on the history of the street, but he's also got a special guest tonight, Julie Ingebretsen, and they will both be talking a little bit about how things are looking now and how things may be moving forward. So with that, I'm going to turn you over to Iric. And again, if you have questions, please ask them by chat using the chat feature on the toolbar, and we'll entertain questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Iric.
Hi, thank you, Ted, and thank you all for participating in this virtual discussion about Lake Street. This is a new experience for me. I've never spoken to an audience that I can't see, and I know that you're out there. I think I can feel your essence. So Ted and I kept our fingers crossed that the technology gods were with us tonight, and for a moment I thought they weren't. But hopefully things will work out. I have had quite an interesting experience for the last 2 weeks installing a new computer, which has driven me absolutely crazy. And there are still features that I haven't figured out. So we'll just keep our fingers crossed that this is all going to work. I'm sure it will. So I think we've all been really saddened and distressed by the horrific blows that Lake Street received during those difficult days at the end of May. If you've driven down Lake Street recently, you've seen some of the destruction at firsthand. These are clearly hard times for Lake Street. They're hard times for all of us. We have the pandemics. We have other issues swirling around us. But I think we do need to remember history during these difficult times and realize that Lake Street has faced difficult times in the past, but the Lake Street community is resilient. There is a lot of energy there, and I, for one, am hopeful that Lake Street's going to be able to meet the challenges that it faces. As Ted indicated, Julie Ingebretsen is with us tonight. Julie's been in the forefront of the efforts to reopen Lake Street. And I think many of you know that her business has been a real Lake Street mainstay. In fact, and Julie, it is now Ingebretsen's Nordic Marketplace. I think I have that right. Julie's business next year will be celebrating its 100th anniversary on Lake Street. So Julie will be talking about current efforts, but first we do need to look back at Lake Street's early years, and we need to start with that body of water that identifies the street, now known as B'day Makaska, but the lake had another name when it was one of Minneapolis's most prized attractions at the end of the 19th century. Lake Calhoun's first bathhouse was built in 1890 at the north end of the lake at Main Beach, across from what later became the Calhoun Beach Hotel. This image that I hope you can all see now shows the larger, more elaborate bathhouse that opened in 1912. And here are some young kids frolicking in Lake Calhoun, just behind the bathhouse, as kids frolic today. During the teen years of the last century, people started driving their automobiles to the lake, so they didn't need to change in the bathhouse. And this photo shows what the main beach looked like before the time that we had parking lots and parking restrictions. In 1914, the Minneapolis Tribune noted that the bathing suit habit has extended even to those living many blocks from the lake and fortunate enough to own an automobile. The sight of machines, that meant autos filled with bathing suits, bathing suit people, is almost as common as the machines themselves. So clearly folks were able to start driving to the lake, but in the early days, Lake Street was certainly not anything like it was today. Nearly 6 miles from Lake Street, another recreation site attracted visitors, but this attraction was short-lived. Wonderland Amusement Park, the predecessor of Excelsior Amusement Park, for those of you of a certain age, and of course today's Valley Fair. Wonderland lasted only from 1905 to 1911, and it covered roughly a 6 square block section of South Minneapolis at Lake Street between 31st and 33rd Avenue South. But unfortunately, during its final years, Wonderland began to lose steam, facing cold, rainy summers. The rides began to break down. Some of them were condemned, and finally Wonderland closed in 1912, and it was demolished in that same year. And those blocks on Lake Street began to fill in with the bungalows that we know today. But there is one interesting remnant from the early days, and that's this rather modest-looking apartment building on 31st Street. This is a current view of the apartment building. And during the Wonderland era, this was a hospital for premature babies. Now, when I heard about this hospital in an amusement park, I thought it was rather bizarre. I wondered if it was some kind of a show, but I later found that it really was a serious attempt to promote a new technique for dealing with premature babies. And the German doctor who had perfected these new techniques wanted to show it off in a place where there were lots of people gathering. So that's why he built his premature babies hospital in Wonderland. Here's a scene of the nurses working with the little children. At the turn of the last century, that stretch of Lake Street between Lake Calhoun and Wonderland was really a little more than a rough, unpaved roadway, dusty during the dry days, muddy in the wet days. But soon after the turn of the century, there were really major changes in store for what would become the city's major thoroughfare. In 1905, Twin City Rapid Transit Company began streetcar service along Lake Street. And the next year, the new bridge across Lake Street opened, and the bridge enabled the transit company to provide streetcar services between the two cities. And that really launched Lake Street's emerging role as a major transportation route. But in 1905, 1906, Lake Street's new role was really still in its infancy. The street really had not even been paved, even though the streetcar was going down there. And in 1906, the Minneapolis Journal reported that Lake Street between the new bridge and Minnehaha Avenue was, quote, in a fearful condition, making it impossible for people to either drive or walk. Property bought with the intention of improving and building had to be put on hold while the street was being improved. But the speculators who flocked to South Minneapolis and the developers didn't have long to wait. By 1910, Lake was fully paved from Hennepin to the river, and by 1913, 350 businesses were located along the newly paved roadway. But still, Lake Street was mainly a collection of what we would call today commercial nodes. And the businesses clustered around key intersections, those intersections with the north-south streets. And the first of the commercial nodes occurred at Lake and Lyndale, known back then as Lyndale Corners. Lyndale was the one street that went from the north city limits to the south city limits, and so obviously Lake and Lyndale was a key intersection. And this is how the Lyndale Corners looked at about 1900. Now, if you look over, and unfortunately I don't have a pointer that I can use, but at the left end of this photograph, you can see a building with arches. I think you can just see it behind the telephone pole with all those streams of telephone lines. And that building in the picture here from 1900 is the Crowell building, dating from 1888. And that building is still standing. We know it today as the former home of It's Greek to Me restaurant. So if you've been to the Greek to Me, unfortunately closed a couple of years ago, you would have been in the 1888 Crowell building. 6 blocks to the west of Lyndale, an even more prominent commercial node took shape, and today we know that area as Uptown, but the term Uptown didn't really come into use until about the 1930s. The Hennepin Lake Commercial District developed somewhat later than Lyndale Corners. Initially, Hennepin Avenue was scheduled to be a parkway that would connect downtown Minneapolis with Lake Calhoun, but Hennepin began to fill in with commercial development, and early in the 20th century, the park board of the city abandoned the plan to make Hennepin a parkway, and so Hennepin and Lake became a important commercial intersection. That intersection was anchored by 2 buildings, one located on the southeast corner of Lake and Hennepin, and here is a view of that building, the Giannakopoulos building. It was built by Nick and John Giannakopoulos to house their Lakeview confectionery store. The facade of that building is still there. It's been incorporated in the Calhoun Square development from the 1980s, but you can see at least the remnants of the Giannakopoulos building. The building kitty corner from Giannakopoulos on the northwest corner, that building is still standing today. It's been remodeled many times, and so it's virtually, you can't recognize it. I think today the building is called the Rainbow Building, from its most famous tenants, the Rainbow Cafe, a real landmark. Those of a certain age used to take our dates there after movies on Saturday night. I remember the Rainbow very well. Rainbow operated from 1919, and in 1979, the Lagueros family that ran the restaurant closed it, and it survived for a few years later. So what you're looking at here is the Abdallah Candy Store. Abdallah's is still around as a business, but no longer located in Minneapolis. Down the street from these 2 buildings, the Walker Library opened in 1911. That building is still standing. It's an event center, and the 1911 building is the first of 3 Walker libraries at that intersection. But of course, Lake and Hennepin's most notable landmark had a different name when it opened in 1913. It was known as the Lagoon. And here is an ad for opening night at the Lagoon Theater in 1913. But the name of the building changed in 1929. It was renamed the Uptown and named in honor of the district. It got a new designation, and in 1939 it got the Art Deco makeover that you know today. And it took me a little while to realize this, but if you look at the side of the theater, the back of that side, not where the arch windows are, that wall is the original wall from the 1913 building. A little factoid that I wasn't going to bring up, but I can't resist. Larry Millette, who was one of my all-time favorite heroes, he really pioneered architectural history. I will have to say, and Larry, please forgive me, Larry had a mistake in his book. He said that the Lagoon building was torn down in 1939. That's not the case. It was just remodeled. So the original 1913 building is behind the Art Deco facade of the Uptown Theater. At least before the pandemic, the Uptown was the last remaining early movie palace that was still showing movies. Hopefully one of these days it will start again. In fact, it might actually be starting. I don't know that for a fact. Beyond Lake Street, there are several, beyond Hennepin at least, there were several iconic businesses established during the early decades of the 20th century. Oops, sorry about that. We missed something here. During the World War I era, there was a major construction project that really changed the character of the Lake Street corridor. And that construction project lowered the railroad lines just to the north of Lake Street into a ditch. The purpose of that reconstruction, which was quite a project, took 4 years, was to eliminate the at-grade crossings. There were 50 of them crossing the railroad lines at grade, causing many, many accidents. And this project lowered the railroad line and eliminated those at-grade crossings. And of course, that project made possible the Midtown Greenway that we know today. On to Schatz Line Saddle Shop, just to the east of the Hennepin intersection. Emil Schatzline, shown here, opened his saddle shop in 1910, and the Schatzline Saddle Shop is still in business today, still run by the Schatzstein family, the grandchildren of Emil Schatzline, not at its original location, but close to it. So Schatzline Saddle is the oldest building, still operating on Lake Street. To the east of Lyndale, and we're moving from west to east, Nicollet Avenue was another key intersection. It had an early rail line going to Lake Street, and in 1896 it made possible for a new ballpark for the Minneapolis Millers to open up. And in 1896, on opening day, the Tribune reported that the Millers won their home game, their first home game in the new park, by beating the Milwaukee Brewers. Those of you who are real baseball buffs will probably have all those statistics, knew who pitched, who batted, but I can't tell you any of that. I think there is a book, however, about Nicollet Park that tells you all of that. The Minneapolis Tribune reported that nearly 4,000 fans were delighted by the game and the grounds, and it seemed like there was a new team. Now, the photo that you see here is from 1904, and this is a game between the Millers and the St. Paul Saints. Their streetcar rivals in 1904, and from the dress of the men in the crowd, you can see that leisure wear was not yet in vogue, and it always amazes me that these folks dressed up, and look at all the bowler hats out there. And I've searched through the photo, and I don't see any women in the crowd, so apparently it was not something that the ladies did very often, but that's the way things were at that time. Up through the 1920s, Lake Street was really a line with basically 1- and 2-story frame buildings. There was actually one 5-story building, the Calhoun building, just to the west of Lindale, that opened in I think 1905. But the profile of Lake Street would change dramatically in the 1920s when the Sears complex was built just to the east of Chicago Avenue. Here's a photo of the Sears complex, the distribution center for Sears Midwest District. And actually the complex looks very much like it does today. The front, the low 2-story, actually 3-story building at the front of the photo was the Sears retail store with the tower behind it. And that 16-story tower would soon become obviously the key landmark on Lake Street. The Sears building had a new innovation, a parking lot. And so we can say that Sears was the first auto-oriented retail development in Minneapolis, probably the first commercial development that had its own parking lot. And the parking lot was modeled after the lot that Sears built for its first store in Chicago. And in recent years, the city of Minneapolis has designated the Sears parking lot as a historic site because it was the first commercial parking lot in the city. And if you come to the Sears complex today, now known as Midtown Exchange, there is a parking lot on the Chicago side of the building, and that's because it is a historic parking lot. We should note, of course, that sadly the Sears store closed in 1994. We'll talk about that in just a little while. But now we're moving on to a project that our guest, and hopefully, Julie, are you unmuted? I hope you are. This is Ingebretsen's Model Market, opened in 1929. Charles Ingebretsen, Julie's grandfather, opened this store. And Julie, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Well, Julie, can you tell us a little bit about Ingebretsen's, about Charlie, and that early store?
Sure. Yeah, my Grandpa Charlie came from Norway in 1915 or 1910 or 1915. Landed on the West Bank, Cedar Riverside, where a lot of the Scandinavian immigrants started out. Moved south to Lake Street, along kind of with the Scandinavian community. And he opened the store where we are right now, 1603 in 1921. He opened a few other stores around town, but this was the one that stuck, obviously. One of many little neighborhood groceries or neighborhood butcher shops, because they didn't have refrigeration back then. So people would hop on the trolley and, you know, stop on their way home from work and pick up dinner and go home. So it was that kind of a store for a very long time until the 60s, I guess. It was pretty much that way. We could talk about that part later, right, Eric? Yeah,
we're going to talk about the 1970s era in just a little bit. So I see, I love the ads here, Fresh Fish Daily, and I'm assuming that Charlie and Al sold lutefisk back then. Although maybe people made lutefisk at home, maybe not. Well, we'll have.
I don't know. Hard to know.
Well, we'll talk about lutefisk a little later in Ingebretsen's modern era. So let's move on, and Julie's going to come back when we get into the 1970s. But I am going to move on now to the next intersection, which is Cedar, and Cedar and Lake is the location of probably the oldest development in South Minneapolis, originally known as Lehman Cemetery. And this cemetery dates to 1853, when the site was part of the Fort Snelling Military Reservation. And it was on property owned by Martin Lehman, who was one of the early Minnesota settlers. And that cemetery is now known as the Pioneers and Soldiers Cemetery, a very historic site, and you can see it today when you go down Lake Street. Moving on to the next corridor, then we come to the Hiawatha Minnehaha corridor, and when we get to that corridor, in the early days, the character of Lake Street went through a significant transformation. It really became an industrial area, and as early as the 1890s, there was a industrial business located here. In 1902, a business then known as Minneapolis Steel and Machinery opened at Lake and Hiawatha. There was a railroad line that ran, an earlier railroad line adjacent to Hiawatha, and so that made this industrial development possible. Minneapolis Steel and Machinery morphed into the Minneapolis Moline Company, which was one of the city's largest industrial manufacturers up until it closed in 1972. At its high point in World War II, when it built Jeeps, Moline employed more than 4,000 workers. When Moline closed and its plant was destroyed, demolished, Target store developed on that site, and we'll talk about that in just a little while. Right to the east of the Moline plant along 27th Avenue, there was a commercial development that got going, a commercial node there. That was anchored by Freeman's Department Store, which was at one point the largest department store outside of downtown. And this ad, I think, is really interesting. This is from, I think, 1940. And if you'll see here, although there's pretty snazzy dresses advertised, Freeman says that it will accept relief orders. So 1940, the Depression was still with us. The building owned by E.B. Freeman that housed his department store is known as the Coliseum Building, and that building is still standing. One more little factoid that I can't resist, and I kept telling myself I'm not going to interject, but I can't help it. So E.B. Freeman was the first cousin of Orville Freeman, our Minnesota governor, those of you who know your DFL history. And Orville Freeman and his first cousin, E.B. Freeman, lived a block apart on Seabury Avenue. So you learned something new tonight about the Freemans. 27th and Lake was also the site of one of the early buildings. I don't have a photo of it here. An early fire station. That building is still standing, and that's now known as the Hook and Ladder. It is a events center. Notable sites east of 27th and Lake include the East Lake Library, which opened in 1924. That's now the site of the Northern Sun business, which sells political t-shirts. I'm sure they're doing a land order business now. And then farther to the east is the American Rug Laundry, which is the oldest continuing operating business at its original location. Schatz Lines is the oldest business, but not at its original location. The American Rug Laundry, which opened in 1918, is at its original location. Here's an interesting ad that I came across in 1918. American Rug Laundry is advertising that you can guard against the influenza by cleaning your rug. And of course, in 1918, in November of 1918, was the peak of the influenza pandemic, and we certainly know about pandemics today, that's for sure. Then one very dark, particularly difficult site for me, being Jewish, is the River Lake Gospel Tabernacle. This was the site of a church by a radio evangelist named Luke Rader and his son Paul. Luke and Paul were virulent anti-Semites. They laced their sermons with terrible anti-Semitic diatribes, and that is one of the reasons that Minneapolis was known as a capital of anti-Semitism in the 1940s. I've been told that Jewish people, I grew up in the Jewish north side of Minneapolis, were afraid to walk in front of the River Lake Tabernacle. Luke was also connected with the Silver Shirts, a right-wing group, and we also know about right-wing groups today. Interesting contemporary parallels. So the River Lake Gospel Tabernacle is gone, and its site is now a mixed-use apartment retail development. There is a very nice Dunn Brothers located there. By World War I, the Lake Street, at least from a physical standpoint, had taken shape, and virtually every block between Lake Calhoun and Lake Street was filled with early commercial developments, but life along the corridor was much different during the first 2 to 3 decades of the 20th century up until the 1940s than it is today. 1930s, just as the talkies were getting started in Hollywood, Lake Street was home to nearly a dozen movie theaters, and it had become South Minneapolis's Great White Way. That year, in January 1930, I had to check my notes here. Hold on just a minute. Harold Lloyd, a great silent comedian, had his first talkie movie, Welcome Danger, at the movie theater. The Granada was later renamed the Suburban World, and Suburban World's been closed for quite a while, and I think it's now going to be reopening as a events center. And in 1930, those folks that were back then could see Joan Crawford in her first talking movie, Untamed, showing at the newly renamed Uptown Theater. Throughout the 1930s, the Lake Street theaters provided a respite from the Depression for the thousands of families in South Minneapolis, but those South Minneapolis neighborhoods, the area that we now know as Longfellow particularly, didn't feel the full force of the Depression. According to Wallace Freeman, whose family operated Freeman's department store, I had an opportunity to interview Wallace Freeman in the early 1990s, and he told me that many of the people who came to his family's store still had jobs at the Ford plant, although the Ford plant did close for a while in the Depression, and also at Minneapolis Moline, which was still open. And Wallace Freeman told me, well, the people in the neighborhood, they were Swedes and Norwegians who were by nature thrifty, and they didn't waste their money, and they knew that there was a good value at Freeman's department store, so they continued to shop there. And Freeman's did stay open all through the 1930s during the Depression, when many other retail stores in the city closed. The end of the Great Depression, with the advent of World War II, the economy boomed. People had money to spend. They went to the movies. They also went to a new grocery store that opened up. And again, I didn't put this slide in the slideshow. I missed it. This was Hove's grocery store that opened up at Lake and Hennepin in 1939, just to the west of the Lake and Hennepin intersection. It was a new development. It was a supermarket where you would go through the aisles and pick up the things that you wanted rather than go to the counter. Hove's later became a lunch store. Now that original store on Hennepin, just off of Hennepin and Lake, is still open today, and it is a Lunds and Byerly's. Let's see what else we have here. Through the 30s and into the 50s, movie theaters attracted huge crowds. Several of them had a Art Deco makeover. This is one of them, the Rialto Theater. It reopened in 1937. It's interesting that the movie theaters were bringing in lots of money during the Depression. The movie theater owners were actually doing well because the people that had a few nickels to spend went to the movies, and so they began remodeling their theaters with this Art Deco look. And grand opening movie in 1937 was Kid Galahad, starring Betty Davis. I can just basically pick up that. Lake Street continued to boom during the 50s and into the 60s. As it became auto row, and in the immediate post-World War II area, had over 20 car dealers along Lake Street. One of the most prominent of them was Grossman Chevrolet. That building actually is still standing, and I used to know the name of it, but unfortunately I'm blanking on that. And Grossman was a key Lake Street anchor up through the 1970s. People could take the trolleys throughout the Twin City area until 1904, when the Twin City Rapid Transit Company eliminated streetcars, replaced them with buses. The end of the trolley meant that the massive Twin City Rapid Transit shop at 21st Avenue and Lake Street was demolished. When that facility was demolished, it was replaced with the High Lake Center, which we still have today. 1938, just backtracking a little, Uptown had become the city's largest commercial district outside of downtown. More than 100 small retail businesses located within a 2-block radius of Hennepin and Lake. They included 5 gas stations, 7 cafes, 6 grocery stores, and 2 movie theaters. And you can just barely make out on the left side of the screen here a marquee for the Rainbow Cafe. I can see it just barely, maybe you can as well. Lake Street continued to boom up till the early 60s, but there were clearly dark clouds on the horizon as a suburban boom began to sap the economic vitality of inner city commercial districts all over the country. And the suburban boom was accentuated by the interstate highway system that enabled residents and businesses to flee to central cities. And that certainly impacted Lake Street. Lake Street's eventual decline in the late 60s was exacerbated by the decision of the highway planners to have I-35W bypass Lake Street. So there was no exchange there. In thinking about this recently, I realized that there had been a freeway exchange at Lake Street. I'm not quite sure how the street would have accommodated that traffic, because it was really not designed to be a huge auto-oriented commercial corridor with 3 lanes of traffic in each direction. But clearly, the decision to bypass Lake Street impacted Lake Street negatively. Another bad decision, and that was to close off Nicollet Avenue at Lake Street to make room for a Kmart store. I think city leaders realized that was probably the worst urban planning decision that they've ever made, and I know that the city now is hoping to reopen Nicollet Avenue at Lake Street now that it's purchased the Kmart site. But Lake Street clearly did struggle, particularly in the decade of the 90s, as the forces of urban decay were really mounting, unfortunately. And that struggle was highlighted by the murder of a Minneapolis police officer at a Lake Street cafe, the Pizza Shack, in 1992. This was the murder of Officer Jerry Hoff as he was having pizza one night at this restaurant. Those of you who were around in the 1990s realize that this was a really, really big deal for the city back in 1992. You know, sadly, we are so used to murders today, it's not front page news anymore. But when Jerry Hoff was murdered, it was a terrible blow to the city, and it contributed to Lake Street getting the label from the New York Times as Murderopolis. And sadly, we are approaching the murders of that era, maybe not quite. 1994, another huge blow when Sears closed and its massive complex was abandoned. It stayed closed for 10 years. There were terrible problems with prostitution, X-rated bookstores. Here's a group of residents picketing the X-rated bookstore at Chicago and Lake. The Rialto, that was an Art Deco gem in the 1930s, had become an X-rated theater by the 1970s. And I think a neighbor of mine at Beckettwood is picketing there. I haven't been able to look at that photo really well. But during the 1970s, there was several new developments. One of those was Calhoun Square at Lake and Hennepin, and you can see the facade of the Giannakopoulos building that I talked about before. Not a particularly successful urban development effort. I think the planners realized that trying to put a suburban type shopping center into the middle of an urban district really didn't work very well. But one very positive development was the opening of a gift shop at Ingebretsen's. This is actually a modern view of Ingebretsen. So Julie, you're still there. We need to unmute you.
Okay, here I am.
Oh, you're unmuted. Okay, so in 1974, the gift shop opens. That's your business. Can you tell us a little bit about what was happening in the 1970s and how the family decided to expand when actually many businesses were fleeing Lake Street?
Yeah, it's so my dad was running the store at that point and had a partner, Warren Dahl. The two of them ran the meat market, and they bought the building in '74. I honestly don't know why. I guess because they could. And it was owned by one of the Greek immigrant families that were so prevalent back in the early days. So they wanted to expand and do a gift shop, and they hired me, and I thought that would be a fun thing to do for a couple of years, and I'm still there. So so that was that. But I think basically we've always really understood the importance of having stable businesses on a street, and we've been able to succeed and maintain our customer base. Even though they have moved out of the neighborhood, they come back from all over the place, and we've been lucky. We've been lucky to be that kind of mainstay on Lake Street and watch the different waves of immigrants come and go. The 90s were tough for sure, and I think we were mainly rescued by the influx of Latino businesses back then, who moved into a lot of the empty storefronts and opened their little businesses and brought a whole lot of energy to the street. And I just think it's really important to point out the importance of Lake Street as a place for immigrants to get their start, like my grandpa did. And it's still happening now. There's a lot of Somali businesses around us now, in addition to the Latinos, and it's it's a really interesting and fun place to be.
Mm-hmm. Good, yeah. I always when I would drive down Lake Street and see all the lines of people out in front, and the mature people from Richfield and other places of Scandinavian descent coming back to the inner city. And I think Julie and her family ran a terrific business. And Julie, you really do need to get credit for your perseverance. I think a lot of folks would not have stuck it out with Lake Street, and you have, and I think it's just been an absolutely wonderful shot in the arm for this important corridor. We do need to move on to another important development on Lake Street nearby, and this is the Heart of the Beast Puppet Theater. That terrific arts group purchased the Avalon Theater in 1987, another porn palace, and made that theater their headquarters. And of course, we know the Heart of the Beast now for their May Day parade. There wasn't a May Day parade this year. I know that Heart of the Beast has faced some challenges. Hopefully, they'll be able to bring back the May Day parade in the future. Julie mentioned the Latino businesses, and certainly they have had a lot to do with the regeneration of Lake Street starting in the 1990s. And also there were a group of nonprofit organizations that came together to promote business development for these immigrant businesses. I was lucky enough to work for one of those organizations and work with a number of the immigrant businesses on Lake Street. In 1999, a number of Latino businesses got together to open their Mercado Central at Lake and Bloomington, and that marketplace is still functioning. They have wonderful new murals on both the Lake Street and the Bloomington side of the building, and also on the back of their building. So if you haven't been over to Lake and Bloomington recently, visit the Mercado and look at their wonderful murals. I think the murals have been up for about 2 years, and they just make that corner of Lake Street sparkle. The next important development was the Sears complex that was redeveloped in the early 2000s, now known as the Midtown Exchange. And that was really made possible by the decision of Allina Health to move their corporate headquarters into the Sears building. Our friends across the river in St. Paul had hoped to get Allina Health for what later became the soccer stadium site. So I'm glad that St. Paul has a soccer stadium, and we have the Midtown Exchange with a lot of employees. At least before the pandemic, there were 500 of them working in the Midtown Exchange building. So the Midtown Exchange also helped spawn a really innovative market, the Midtown Global Market, which is an interesting story in and of itself. Originally, there was a plan for a chain grocery store to build a Latino-oriented market in the Sears complex. The Latino businesses along Lake Street said, no, we want to do this ourselves. We don't want some outside company coming in. And so they worked together with some nonprofits led by a group known as the Neighborhood Development Center, and put together the Global Market, which is now a market for a whole range of minority businesses, Latino, and several Somali businesses, and is thriving. It was closed after the difficulties in May. It's reopening now, and hopefully it'll keep going, but we'll be facing some challenges as well. Here's one of the longtime businesses, Manny's Tortas. Those of you that have been to the Global Market know about Manny's. He's an early Latino business that's persevered, and hopefully we'll be able to continue as more folks are attracted to the Global Market, which has reopened. 2004, First Light Rail Transit Line opened. Now the Blue Line. There was an intersection at Lake Street station there, which I think helped And then, of course, the Midtown Greenway, which opened in segments starting in 2000, and particularly spurred a huge real estate development at the uptown end of Lake Street. Here's a view of some of the apartment buildings, and just a whole line of apartment buildings along the freeway now, along the Greenway, excuse me, from uptown over to Lindale. Uptown has boomed, maybe boomed excessively, some would say. I know there's concern about maintaining the character of uptown, particularly with the massive new apartment building built across from Lund Story. And uptown, of course, has also suffered during the difficulties this summer. So that, I think, brings us up to modern times, and I do want to spend some time for questions. Ted, I think we're still doing okay on time, but I do want to report just some positive news, because this has been such a difficult, troubling time. I worked with a number of those Lake Street businesses, and it just broke my heart to see them destroyed, so badly damaged after all the time there. I still remember planning to go to Gandhi Mahal on a Wednesday night to get some carry-out, a wonderful Indian restaurant. I was there on Tuesday morning. Gandhi Mahal was still there. Wednesday morning, Gandhi Mahal was gone. So just some positive news. I did get a report this morning from Allison Sharkey, who's the executive director of the Lake Street Council. And as many of you may know, the Lake Street Council has raised over $5 million to assist businesses on Lake Street. And Allison reported this morning that 329 businesses, mainly businesses, about 10 of them are nonprofits, received grants totaling just under $5 million. 80% of those grantees are people of color. Just under half of the grantees that have been able to reopen their businesses. The other half are still working plans. Some are planning to relocate, but at least the rebuilding has been started. But these grantees of the Lake Street Council have sustained nearly $30 million of damages as a result of the civil unrest this summer. So there really is a huge challenge ahead, I think, for the Lake Street businesses. So Julie, back to you. I know that you just reopened your business just less than a month ago. You want to tell us a little bit about the reopening and how you made the decision, what you had to do to get Ingebretsen's up and running again?
Yeah, well, we were ready to reopen in June after the big shut for the pandemic early days, and then the riots happened. So we had we had damage. We had broken windows and looting and stuff, but we didn't have any fire, thank goodness. So we had it a lot easier than a lot of folks. So we spent the summer putting it back together, doing some remodeling ourselves that we'd been wanting to do, and kind of took our time. But being reopened has been just marvelous. Our customers are just so happy to be back, and we're so happy to see them. And our neighbors are, at different stages, like you're saying, Iric. It's some people were able to reopen pretty quickly, and some not, and some are still waiting for insurance. Some people are still waiting because there's still kind of, it's still a little scary in certain places. There are still some boarded up spots that are not real pleasant to be around. So it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while, and it's going to take a lot more money. There's a lot of effort being put into trying to find the funding to rebuild in an affordable way, so that the little businesses that could afford Lake Street still can. It's a lot more expensive to build a new building than it is to, fix up an old one. So there's a lot of challenges, but the spirit is great and the support has been amazing. You mentioned the We Love Lake Street Fund, the fundraiser of Lake Street Councils, which is well over 10 million now, and still continuing. So that's been really encouraging. But we're going to need a lot more support, really, really big support from, I don't know where, government, maybe philanthropy, or I don't know. But Lake Street has been in tough times before and survived, and we certainly will again.
Yeah. Well, I know that there has been some efforts to get funding from the legislature. We know, of course, about political stalemates that we're facing this summer. And hopefully, depending on what happens in November, that the legislature next year might be able to vote some funds to encourage the rebuilding, because I know that so many of the businesses there really want to continue and want to rebuild, but meeting the financial challenges will be really daunting. So Ted, maybe at this point we can open up. I think we have some time left, and Ted, I will let you do what you need to do to let people ask questions. So Julie and I will be here for that next phase of the program.